Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, it's a big day today, October 1st, 2024. Former President Jimmy Carter is 100 years old, and I know a lot of people are really happy to see that happen. I am one of them. Regardless of what one thinks about his politics or his presidency, he is a really good guy who's done a lot of really good things for the world, even after leaving office. And I, for one, am glad that he's on this planet, though I, as a fellow Christian as he is, know that he probably very much longs to be with his wife, who has gone before him. So maybe he was hanging on for 100, I don't know. But either way, I'm glad that he's able to be our first former president to reach 100 years old. And I thought it would be appropriate then for us to go back to our friend Matt at Useful Charts and take a look at a chart he did just a couple of days ago, Jimmy Carter's family tree. Now, you might think, well, what does it really matter what Jimmy Carter's family tree is when it comes to history? Well, we talk all the time about lenses through which we view history. And on yesterday's live stream, I was talking a little bit about how looking at our own family history is a lens through which to view history. So, for example, I can read all about how there was a place called the Sugar House Prison in New York City that held prisoners of war during the American Revolution. And that is interesting. And I can go down into Lower Manhattan and I can see the marker that remembers where the Sugar House Prison was. But to go then and find out that my fifth great-grandfather, which is my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Peter Stillwagon, was held in the Sugar House Prison for 23 months, that gives me a new lens through which to view that, because that had a direct impact on my family. And by learning his story, I'm learning American history. So as we look at Jimmy Carter and as we look at his history, we're going to see how how whatever lines we choose to focus on here of his family tree, how they weave in and out of English or American or other history. And we're also, I'm sure, going to see how he's connected to other people, because we are all connected. And you might be surprised if you start looking into your own family history to find out how you're connected to other people, because we're all connected. I would say probably 75% of the people whose family history I have researched for them, I've ended up finding some connection between their family and my own. Because if you get back far enough, they're all connected. So I'll be curious to see if my line connects anywhere with Jimmy Carter's. But it's a cool way to look at history. The link is down in the description. Check out Useful Charts. He's got a lot of really cool stuff. I've got some of his charts hanging in my display areas myself, where all my, I just knocked my phone off the table, where all of my memorabilia and things like that is on display. So I'm curious to see what he has to say about this one. Give it a look when you get a chance. Useful Charts. It's a great channel. Let's dive in.
Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm going to show you the family tree of Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States. Carter is already the longest living president in U.S. history. However, this coming Tuesday, he will pass yet another milestone, becoming the first ever president to reach 100 years of age. This is 6 years longer than George Bush Sr., and 7 more than both Ford and Reagan. Of course, the oldest serving president is the current one, Joe Biden. When he steps down on January 20th of next year, he will be 82. The other interesting thing about Jimmy Carter is the number of famous people he's related to.
And I believe now Jimmy Carter has lived longer after his presidency than John F. Kennedy lived in his whole life. Jimmy Carter had just become president when I was born. I was born, about 7 months into his presidency? And now I'm 47, and he's still with us. Pretty crazy.
On the family tree I'll be showing you today, we'll see Elvis, Johnny Cash, Berry Gordy, Ed Helms, Richard Nixon, Robert E. Lee, and many other names that you'll recognize.
I know Lee's got Carters in his family tree, and I know where Johnny Cash is going to come in, probably through his wife, who was a Carter, June Carter Cash.
But first, I want to show you how you can make your own family tree with the help of today's sponsor, MyHeritage. All you have to do is enter your name, your parents' names, and as much as you can about your 4 grandparents. With just these 7 names, MyHeritage can get started building a much larger family tree for you. Within seconds, it will automatically start searching its database of over 21 billion records.
I will say this, if you do start working on your family history, be careful, especially if you're like on Ancestry and you start getting the leaf that like it gives you recommendations and says, ooh, I think I know who the parents are of this person. Be careful, because very often what it does is it looks at other people's family trees, and a lot of people are not particularly concerned about documentation and proof. They just find a name and it looks like their person and they want it to be their person, so they throw it in their family tree. And there are ridiculous amounts of mistakes in those family trees on Ancestry. So be careful with doing that research, because I actually, when I was first starting out, there was somebody who did a family history on one of the families I'm related to in Kentucky. And they had the entire book based on a mistake that they made in like the second generation of research, because there were two people with the same first and last name born in the same county in the same year, and they had the wrong one. So just be careful.
These records include census lists, newspapers, birth certificates, and much more, including the research done by other users. Once it finds matches, discovery links will automatically appear on your tree. If you determine that the match is correct, you might be able to add as many as 50 extra people to your tree with the simple click of a button. MyHeritage.
Whoa. Those Bakers look familiar. I have an Andrew Baker in my family tree. Oh boy, we're probably related.
Also gives you access to lots of great tools that make learning about your ancestors so much easier. So if you'd like to build your own family tree, you can sign up for a 14-day free trial of MyHeritage right now by clicking the link in the description.
It's really fun. It's a lot of fun to do. It really
As a
is.
Useful Charts viewer, you will also get 50% off their premium membership. All right, back to the family tree of Jimmy Carter. Let's start with his surname, which was brought to England during Norman times by a French knight called Le Carretier, meaning the cart driver. Over the centuries, this name eventually evolved into the more Anglo-sounding Carter. By the early 1600s, one of the descendants of that Norman knight was a wealthy London winemaker named John William Carter.
Yeah, just researching the origin of surnames is so much fun. There's a lot of fascinating stuff to be found just in that. And don't get caught up in spelling if you do research. Spelling means very little. My great-grandparents, the last name is spelled differently on the tombstone than how I spell it. Most people 150 years ago, especially if they were just like subsistence farmers like most people were, couldn't read or write. And so it was whoever was writing down the information, they decided how it was spelled. Names change over the centuries. My last name, Maury, was, if we go back through the family tree, the name was Maurer, M-A-U-R-E-R, and they were from Guggenbach in Germany. And when they came to the United States, it eventually went through several iterations before it became Maury. And if you go down to Kentucky, they pronounce it Maury. So it's kind of funny.
He is thought to have been the father of Jimmy Carter's 9 times great-grandfather, Thomas Carter Sr., as well as John Carter, the father of Robert King Carter. Now, before we look at the Isle of Wight branch, which leads to Jimmy Carter, I first want to tell you about this Carrotaman branch. John Carter, having been born in England, decided in 1635 to immigrate to the colony of Virginia. That was just 28 years after the founding of Jamestown, Virginia, the very first permanent English settlement in the Americas. So this means that the Carters go way back in terms of American history.
Yeah, I mean, that's about as far back as most people are going to get, as into the early 1600s. 1620, you have Plymouth. 1607, you have Jamestown. And within a couple of decades, both Virginia and Massachusetts have exploded in growth.
John Carter built a plantation on the Carrotaman River, hence the name of this branch. But both he and his first 2 sons died at relatively young ages, leading his third son, Robert Carter, to inherit a lot of wealth at a very young age. In time, Robert went on to become the richest man in the colonies, as well as the acting governor of Virginia, which is why he was eventually known by the nickname King Carter. Now, remember, we are talking about the colonial South here. So, yes, King Carter was a major slave owner. According to his will, he had 3,000 enslaved individuals working on his 300,000 acres.
I have never heard of a slave owner having that many enslaved people. 3,000? Wow. Well, I learned something new today.
His daughters, named Anne, married into another prominent Virginian family, the Harrisons. Her son, Benjamin Harrison V, was one of the signers of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And then his son, William, ended up becoming the 9th president of the United States.
And so you can see right there how closely connected these guys are. William Henry Harrison is the grandson of Ann Carter, and her brother John Carter is the great-grandfather of Robert E. Lee. So that makes them second cousins once removed.
But that's not all.
It's pretty close.
There was a second Harrison president as well, William's grandson, Benjamin, who became...
Hey, but let's not skip over John Scott Harrison here. He was an Ohio congressman who, when he died in 1878, his body was snatched by body snatchers. And his son, Benjamin Harrison, who becomes a senator from Indiana and then president of the United States, actually leads a group of people who find his father's body hanging from a meat hook.
Named the 23rd U.S. president. Yet another prominent family in early Virginia was the Hill family, owners of the Shirley Plantation, which to this day is the oldest active plantation in the U.S. King Carter's son John married the heiress of that estate, and hence their descendants became known as the Hill Carters. The most famous Hill Carter is John's granddaughter Anne, who was the mother of the Confederate general Robert E. Lee. But in this branch, I also want to point out King Carter's most senior heir, Robert Carter III. He ended up having some sort of religious awakening that led him to do something very unusual for the time. He started freeing all of his slaves, emancipating over 500 enslaved individuals by the time of his death.
Imagine, it's easy for us to say, well, yeah, that's what he should have done. But at that time and place, the amount of wealth that is involved with owning that many slaves and then freeing that number of people, that is a tremendous amount of wealth that he is giving up. That says a lot about who this guy was, that he was willing to do that.
Which ended up being the largest emancipation in the U.S. prior to the declaration made by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. Okay, let's now look at the Isle of Wight branch, which is so named because that's the county in Virginia where Thomas Carter Sr. settled.
No, Isle of Wight County is not an island, but it's named after the Isle of Wight. A lot of these early settlements are named after places in England. That's why you have Plymouth, for example, the colony that's set up in Massachusetts, because they left from Plymouth. And to this day, if you actually go over to England and you go to see Plymouth Argyle, the football team, soccer team, they're known as the Pilgrims, and they have a ship as their image.
It was either the brother or the nephew of John Carter of the Carrotaman branch. As a whole, the exact details of the Isle of Wight branch are a little less certain, but we do know that we eventually get a descendant of Thomas Carter Sr. named Kindred Carter, who was the first person in this line to settle in Georgia.
And you see the question mark, you're thinking, well, why don't we know when he died? Well, based on records, sometimes that's the best you can do is say, well, you know what, I think it's around this time. Even much later, I have a third grandfather that I don't know when he died because there are no records of his death in Kentucky, in the county where he lived, in Carter County. But I know he was alive in 1890 because he is on tax records. But then after that, he isn't. So we think maybe he died around 1890, but sometimes that's the best you can do.
Jimmy Carter's home state. For the next few generations, the Carters operated cotton farms. And yes, they were indeed slave owners. In fact, during the Civil War, Jimmy Carter's great-grandfather, Littlebury Carter, fought on the side of the Confederacy. Take note that Littlebury's mother was Anne Ainsley, who was a descendant of a certain Richard Morris. Well,
all connected.
Guess who was also a descendant of Richard Morris? Richard Nixon, the man who was president just 3 years before Carter. This makes Nixon and Carter sixth cousins. But back to Littlebury Carter. After the Civil War,
So I want to see what unit Littlebury Carter was in, and if he was in any famous battles or anything. Okay, so he was in the 11th Battalion of the Georgia Artillery Company, or Battery A, the Sumter Artillery. So this was organized in the spring of 1862. Sent to Virginia, they served in the Richmond area until September, and then fought with the Army of Northern Virginia from the Maryland Campaign to Cold Harbor. So that means he was at Antietam, he was at Gettysburg, he was at Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, and saw action all the way to Appomattox. Wow, interesting. So they only had 44 present by April 9th of 1865. So I'm going to look and see if I can find his specific information, find out if he was with the unit that whole time. All right, so I've gone to fold3.com. They have all of these military records online. You can search them. So here's L.B. Walker Carter. That's him. He's got quite a long history here, so that tells me he most likely was there for all of this stuff. Looks like he enlisted in March of 1862 as a private. And then we can see they did these muster rolls. They have records every 2 months, plus any like special ones, like if there's an injury or a wound or he's captured or anything, any promotions, that's all going to show up. But it looks like he's present for basically all of these muster rolls, which means he probably was there till nearly the end. He's paroled May 18th, 1865, so he is there to the very end, it appears. Yeah. So he may have been at Appomattox then. Well, if he was paroled in May, I don't know. I guess it depends on when they process that parole. But assuming that that battery was with the Army of Northern Virginia all the way to the end. Oh, yeah, absent on detail by order of General Lee. And that's late October of 63. Wow. All right. So he's there. He's there for all of it. That's pretty cool. There's how history is connected. Jimmy Carter's great-grandfather with the Army of Northern Virginia from Antietam all the way to Appomattox in the artillery. They probably were a part of the artillery barrage at Gettysburg on July 3rd. I have to see what unit they were with. Okay, so this is them right here. This is Cutts Artillery Battalion. That would have been the Sumter Artillery. Carter was in Company A. So at Gettysburg, he's in Anderson's division, which is part of the 3rd Corps. So yeah, I think they probably would have been involved in that artillery barrage because the 3rd Corps was right in the center of the Confederate Army. They were up in the area between Longstreet, who was on the right of the Confederates, and then the 2nd Corps under Ewell, which was on the Confederate left. The 3rd Corps kind of held the middle between, right in the area around the town of Gettysburg. So cool stuff. All right, that was a big tangent. Let's get back to the video.
Littlebury continued to farm, but he also became the part owner of a merry-go-round in town. At age 42, he and his business partner got into a fight, which resulted in Littlebury being stabbed in the neck.
What?
He died 1 week later, and then just a few hours after the funeral, his wife died as well. The papers say it was from a broken heart.
Holy
I'm
cow.
thinking maybe suicide.
Listen, this is why family history is so cool. I mean, it's not cool that he was killed the way that he was, but those are the kind of insane stories that you find when you start researching your family tree.
Either way, their son Billy, Jimmy Carter's grandfather, was left without parents at age 15. He ended up doing well for himself, though, eventually owning a winery, several sawmills, and a store. But then history repeated itself. Billy accused some tenants of stealing a desk, and they responded by beating him up and then shooting him in the back while he tried to crawl away. Witnessing the whole thing was Jimmy Carter's father, James Sr., who was only 9 years old at the time. At this point, Billy's widow, Nina, and their 6...
Oh my gosh. And then to think that from that comes Jimmy Carter, who is this very gentle, kind of kind person who is all about other people and serving. That's something pretty cool.
Children moved to Plains, Georgia, to be near extended family. After serving stateside during World War I, James Sr. ended up operating a small grocery store, and then later, more famously, a peanut farm, along with several other agricultural ventures.
And if you ever go down to that area it's kind of southwestern Georgia, Andersonville Prison, it's actually called Camp Sumter. And so you had the Sumter Artillery. I think that's Sumter County there. So it's all connected. You could go visit the historic sites related to Jimmy Carter, and you can visit Andersonville while you're there.
Just before his early death from cancer, he also served for 6 months in the Georgia State House of Representatives as a Democrat. Let me now switch gears and tell you a bit about the other side of Jimmy Carter's family.
And here's an interesting thing to point out there, because his father was a Democrat. And this is why when we talk about this whole idea of party switch, it's complicated. There was no straight switch, because by that theory, then, a Southern Democrat from the 1950s would be a Republican today. And Jimmy Carter's very much still a Democrat. It's complicated. There are so many factors, and it's not just a straight swap. It's a continual evolution of parties and of party affiliations depending on the issue. And it's happening again right now.
That of his mother, Lillian Gordy. She too was the descendant of slave owners, the most recent being her grandfather, James T. Gordy. When he was 26, he impregnated an enslaved 14-year-old girl named Esther Johnson.
Oh.
Now, whether or not this was a forcible rape, it was still rape because A,
Right.
she was a child, and B, he literally owned her. So
Right. So the debate over whether or not she was into it is irrelevant, because she was owned by him. But this happened all the time. And this is why, if you are African American, there's a good chance, unless your family came, like, say, Barack Obama, for example, whose father was born in Africa. If your family goes back to the pre-war South, the antebellum South, then chances are very, very good you have European DNA, just because this was such a common thing. My third great-grandmother was one of those enslaved people who had children with her owner.
true consent wasn't possible.
Right.
Unfortunately, this type of thing was very common prior to emancipation, and it explains why most Black Americans today have at least some white ancestry.
Yep, 100%.
Esther's child was named Barry, and after becoming a free person, he too had a son named Barry,
Wow.
who in turn had Barry Gordy III, the founder of Motown Records. This means that Barry Gordy and Jimmy Carter are second cousins. Now, I've already done a
That's
video
crazy.
on the family
That's cool.
tree of Barry Gordy and all the famous people.
So you got Beyonce and Marvin Gaye in there, and the Jacksons, not all directly related, but all tied into the same family.
People on that tree, such as Marvin Gaye, Jermaine Jackson, Diana Ross, the guys from LMFAO, and even Beyonce. So if you want to see how Jimmy Carter is connected to all of them, you can find a link to that video in the description. But right now, I want to point out that James T. Gordy's wife was named Harriet Helms, and that she was the granddaughter of a woman named Sarah Presley. Sarah Presley was the first cousin of Andrew Presley III, who in turn was the 4 times great-grandfather of Elvis Presley. That makes Jimmy Carter and Elvis Presley 6th cousins once removed.
And again, 1977, the common link here. I was born in 1977. Elvis Presley died when I was 11 days old in August of 1977. Jimmy Carter became president in 1977. It's all connected.
Take note also that Sarah Presley and her sister Elizabeth both married men from the Helms family. Whereas the line of Sarah Presley Helms leads to Jimmy Carter, the line of Elizabeth Presley Helms leads to actor Ed Helms, known mostly for his role in the show The Office.
I'm related to Elvis as well. I want to see if it's through that same family. Now, I'm related to Elvis through his mom. Through her line goes back to the Tackett family.
Let me now return to Jimmy Carter's mother, who throughout her life worked as a nurse, even serving overseas in the Peace Corps at age 68.
Wow.
Whereas James Sr. was pro-segregation, Lillian was pro-integration, developing friendships in the Black community long before the Civil Rights Movement.
That must have burned her husband, but of course he died in 1953, so maybe she did a lot of that after he was gone.
This obviously made a strong impression on Jimmy Carter,
Yep.
who followed in his mother's footsteps by supporting civil rights once he was in politics. Besides Jimmy, James Sr. and Lillian also had 3 other children. Gloria was an avid motorcyclist and one of the first women to earn membership in Harley-Davidson's 100,000-mile club. Ruth, on the other hand, became a charismatic Christian and was heavily involved in the faith healing movement. And Billy, well, he's mostly remembered for promoting Billy Beer and for causing Billygate due to some shady stuff involving Libya. But here's the strange thing. All three of Jimmy Carter's siblings died at relatively young ages.
I was just sitting there thinking that. Look at that. He outlived his father. I mean, his father died 71 years ago, and he's still alive. So he's greatly outlived his father. He's outlived all of his siblings by at least 30 years now.
All from pancreatic cancer, the same disease that killed their father.
Oh my gosh. They all three died from that? If I had a father and three siblings who all died of pancreatic cancer, I would be like freaking out getting my pancreas checked like every 6 months.
But I guess Jimmy didn't get the gene for that because he escaped that fate and has now reached 100. Okay, so it's now time for me to say a few things about Jimmy Carter himself. Generally speaking, he's someone who is universally well-liked by most Americans today. For example, he's remembered as the hard-working peanut farmer and born-again Christian who once fixed a nuclear reactor while serving in the Navy, and as the long-shot politician who managed to become first, the state senator, second, the governor of Georgia, and then third, the U.S. president.
And the only graduate of the United States Naval Academy to be president.
I think it's been his life post-presidency that has really endeared him to the general public.
100%.
After he left the White House, he spent many decades doing humanitarian work, in particular building homes with Habitat for Humanity.
Listen, this guy was president of the United States. That's like the peak of what you can get to in life. He could have rested on his laurels and lived on that for the rest of his life. Been an advisor, been somebody who like did the speaking circuit and made a ton of money, wrote books and did all of that and sat back and just enjoyed retirement. But up into his 90s, he's still building houses for Habitat for Humanity. That's why whatever you want to say negative about his presidency or about his politics, I will admire the man forever for that kind of stuff. This was a man who was a Christian, by his own profession, a born-again Christian who lived his faith every single day. Taught Sunday school up into his 90s as well. In fact, the church, it's a real small church that he went to, would advertise online when Jimmy was teaching Sunday school because people would want to come to be in his class. I will always admire the man for all of those things.
Long into his old age. And while it is acknowledged that he did make several mistakes during his presidency, there is one mistake that very few people know about, mostly because it happened just a few hours before the Iran hostages were released. On his final day in office, Jimmy Carter became the only president in U.S. history to pardon someone for sexually assaulting a child. That person was Peter Yarrow, from the folk trio Peter, Paul, and Mary. Yarrow has openly admitted that he molested a 14-year-old girl, a crime for which he was convicted. I bring this up not because I want to tarnish Jimmy Carter's reputation, but because I, as a child abuse survivor myself, take these things very seriously and wish that more people did as well. Let me now continue by telling you about Jimmy Carter's immediate family. In 1946, Jimmy married Rosalind Smith, and they remained married until her death less than a year ago. So they were married for 77 years. That's 4 years longer than Queen Elizabeth was married to Prince Philip. They had 4 children. His eldest, who goes by Jack, ran for U.S. Senator in Nevada, but lost to the incumbent Republican. However, his son, Jason Carter, went on to serve as a state senator in Georgia before losing the race for governor in 2014. Then there's Jimmy Carter III, who actually goes by Chip. He's the father of Jimmy Carter IV, who, as of yet, has not had a Jimmy Carter V. Next comes Donnell, who actually goes by Jeff. Not sure why all the boys go by other names. And then,
that's a pretty common thing. If you look in certain families, they go by middle names, they go by nicknames.
And finally, there's Amy, who's the one that most people know because she was just 9 years old when her father became president, and hence grew up in the White House.
And look at that. I mean, 20 years between oldest and youngest kids. And by the time she's a kid in the White House, her father has grandkids.
I should also point out Jimmy Carter's first cousin, Hugh Carter Sr., who served as a Georgia state senator for 12 years, as well as his son, Hugh Carter Jr., who served as one of Jimmy Carter's special assistants during the Carter presidency. Now, there are a lot of
And you see there's Donnell in both of those families.
other famous Americans with the last name Carter that you might be wondering about, such as Sean Carter, better known as Jay-Z, as well as Dwayne Carter, better known as Lil Wayne. Unfortunately, I can't tell you for sure how they connect to this tree, or even if they do, but my guess is that they probably fit on there somewhere.
Yeah.
Remember, going back to the early days of Virginia, the various white Carter families were among the biggest slave owners around. And sadly, as we've already seen, it was not uncommon for male slavers to impregnate enslaved females. Combined
And I've actually, because I have slave owning ancestors in eastern Kentucky and then in other parts of the country, one of the things I've tried to do where possible is when I've found out that I have ancestors who were slave owners, I've tried with what little records there are to try and trace those enslaved people and their families to see if I can maybe connect with some of their families in case their families are looking for them and how they connect. And I've had a little bit of success with that.
this with the fact that enslaved people were often given the surnames of their enslavers, and it's no surprise that Carter is actually the 22nd most common surname among Black Africans today, even though it's the 44th most common among white Americans. But unfortunately, it's far more difficult to find records for Black Carters than it is for white Carters. So unless a DNA test is used, it's hard to make those connections. There are, however,
And how would a DNA test help in that situation? Well, assuming that it's coming through the male line, you would share Y chromosome DNA. This is how I was able to determine who my father was. Y chromosome DNA gets passed down from father to son. And so my father's 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 father, if he had a brother, and assuming they had the same father, any male line descendants from him would have the same Y chromosome DNA as me.
few more famous Carters that we can add to the tree. If we go all the way back to John Carter, the winemaker from England, and then go up 2 generations to Richard Carter, you'll see that Richard had a brother named Thomas.
Now we're going back
If we
real
then go
far.
forward-
We're going back to 1495. That's when Henry VII was King of England. That was Henry VIII's father.
generations down from him, we come to another Thomas Carter, who was yet another Carter to immigrate from England to Virginia. We've called this branch the Barford branch because
And I see that where they connect into the Balls because Ball connects to George Washington then.
they initially lived on the Barford plantation, nearby King Carter's Carrotaman plantation. Thomas Carter of Barford had several sons, including John Carter, who married Frances Bull, sister to Mary Bull. And Mary Bull
George
was the
Washington's
mother
mom.
of George Washington. So basically, the first president had an uncle who was a Carter. Thomas Carter of Barford also had a son named Thomas Jr. And if we go 5 generations down from him, we come to a
Oh, and so there's Williamson Carter. So that's where I connect into this line because Williamson Carter was married to a woman named Martha England, who is the sister of one of my ancestors, a guy named Joseph England.
single mother named Nancy Carter, who had a son named Robert out of wedlock, which is why he took his mother's surname.
And I had always grown up hearing, this is why I tell people, when you hear a story in your family history, don't discount it as being ridiculous and untrue, because there's some bit of truth to it. You just have to figure out what it is. When I first met my future wife, her dad told me that he had an uncle somewhere in his line, and he didn't know where, and he didn't know the guy's name, who had been a bodyguard for Abraham Lincoln. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. No chance. I started doing research, and I come to find out that he had a great uncle who was in this unit called the Union Light. What was it called? I'm trying to remember now. The Union Light Guard. That's what it was called. So what happened was David Todd, who was from here in the Youngstown area where I live, was governor of Ohio, and when he found out that Lincoln didn't have any kind of a bodyguard, because there's no Secret Service protecting Lincoln at this point, he asked Lincoln's permission to raise a company of soldiers, one man from each county in Ohio, 88 counties in Ohio. And the man from Mahoning County, which is where I live, was Emory Swank, who is, in fact, my father-in-law's great uncle. So there was truth to it. So when you hear those stories, don't discount it. I had always been told growing up that June Carter Cash was a distant cousin of ours. And then it was only several years later that I found out how.
Robert, in turn, had several children, including his firstborn, Elvin Pleasant, better known as AP, and his fourthborn, named Ezra. In 1927, AP, along with his wife Sarah and Ezra's wife Maybelle, formed a singing group called the Carter Family. The 1920s is considered to be the decade when country music was born, and the Carter Family singers were some of the very first country musicians to become big stars. Maybelle, in particular, had a very distinct style of guitar picking, and it is often credited with transforming the guitar from being a background instrument to being a lead instrument, something that not only had a big impact on country music, but later on rock music as well. After the original Carter family disbanded in 1944, Maybelle, now known as Mother Maybelle, continued to record music with her daughters, one of whom was named June Carter. In 1968,
you see June right there in the back. That's her right there.
She married one of the greatest country music stars of all time, Johnny Cash.
Yeah, and people forget she was a big star in her own right at that time.
They were married for 35 years and had one child, John C. Cash, who in 2010 joined together with some of his
John Carter Cash
cousins to record an album under the name The Carter Family 3. Okay, so that was a look at the family tree of Jimmy Carter. If you'd like to see the family trees of other U.S. presidents, check out the playlist that will appear on the screen shortly.
All right, so that was really cool. And like I said, it's just a cool way to look at history through a different lens. And I hope that encourages you to maybe get curious about your own family history. Unfortunately, I don't do research for people anymore. I just had too many requests. As this channel has grown, I just didn't have the time or the ability to be able to continue to do that. I do continue to work on my own and write books about families that I'm related to. But I'm always available to answer questions and to give you guidance in the right direction if you're curious about that. So let me know in the comment section below and I'll do what I can for you. Definitely check out the channel Useful Charts. Really cool way to look at history through the lens of connections like this. Happy birthday, President Carter. Thanks for watching.